In this video, we're going to talk about the differences between a Blazor web app and a Blazor WebAssembly app. Hi, I'm Ganesh, and if you're new to my channel, consider subscribing for more content like this. In .NET 8 and later, we can create a Blazor app in one of two ways, using the Blazor web app template or using the Blazor WebAssembly standalone app template. Let's start with the easiest one, the Blazor WebAssembly standalone app template. If we create an application using this template, then the app uses what is known as client-side rendering using the Blazor WebAssembly hosting model. Now, what is client-side rendering? Client-side refers to activity that takes place on the user's system, in our case the client browser, and rendering means to produce the HTML markup that browsers display. So in client-side rendering using Blazor WebAssembly, the application with its components gets downloaded to the client browser and the components execute client-side in the browser on a WebAssembly-based .NET runtime to produce the HTML markup. Now, client-side rendering is always interactive. So if we have a component and there's a button in it with an onClick razor directive attribute set to an event handler, then the button will be functional. Now, what does standalone mean? Standalone simply means that the files of our Blazor WebAssembly application are not being served by a backend ASP.NET Core application. So this means that we don't need a .NET runtime running on the server, and it makes it possible to serve our standalone Blazor WebAssembly app from content delivery networks. Lastly, a Blazor WebAssembly standalone application can become a progressive web application too. A progressive web application is a single-page application that can use browser APIs and other features, but it can also be installed like a desktop application and supports offline use. We can turn on progressive web application in the Blazor WebAssembly standalone app template by checking the checkbox here. Now coming to the Blazor web app template. The Blazor web app template supports multiple scenarios. First, we have static server-side rendering or static SSR. In static SSR, the browser sends a request to the server. On the server, the request is routed to a Blazor component within the app. The Blazor component executes on the server to produce static HTML markup that is sent in the HTTP response back to the client browser. The browser then displays the HTML markup as a web page. Now, a user can interact with the page by clicking on a link or submitting a form. When either of that happens, the browser once again sends a new request to the server and the entire process repeats. Static SSR is also used in frameworks like Razor Pages and MVC. We can enable static SSR for the entire application without adding any interactivity by setting the interactive render mode to none in the Blazor web app template. The next scenario that the Blazor web app template supports is the ability to add interactive server-side rendering on a per component basis. In interactive server-side rendering or interactive SSR, the component executes on the server to produce HTML markup, but the HTML markup is interactive. Such server-side interactivity is achieved by having a real-time SignalR connection between the client browser and the web server. Any user interface events and user interface updates are sent back and forth over this SignalR connection. So if we set the interactive render mode to server and interactivity location to per page or component, this means that we are turning on interactive SSR using the Blazor server hosting model on a per page or component basis. So the entire application will use static SSR, and then on individual components, we can apply the interactive server render mode that turns on interactive SSR only for those components. Next, we have interactive SSR applied globally to the entire application. So we can set the interactive render mode to server and interactivity location to global. This is similar to a Blazor server app in .NET 7 in that the entire application with all its components use interactive server-side rendering via the Blazor server hosting model. Next up, we have client-side rendering or CSR applied on a per component basis. To achieve this, we can set the interactive render mode to WebAssembly and interactivity location to per page or component. In this scenario, the entire application uses static server-side rendering, and any individual components can be marked with the interactive WebAssembly render mode. So only those components get downloaded to the client browser and they execute client-side in the browser on a WebAssembly-based .NET runtime. Then we have client-side rendering or CSR that is applied globally to the entire application. We can achieve this by setting the interactive render mode to WebAssembly and interactivity location to global. This is similar to an ASP.NET Core hosted Blazor WebAssembly app in .NET 7. It is called ASP.NET Core hosted because the files of the Blazor WebAssembly app are being served by a backend ASP.NET Core application running on the server. Next, we can set the interactive render mode to auto, server and WebAssembly, and interactivity location to per page or component. When we do this, the entire application will use static server-side rendering or static SSR, but then we can turn on interactive server-side rendering and client-side rendering on a per component basis. So we can mark certain components with the interactive server render mode and certain components with the interactive WebAssembly render mode. Also, we have the ability to set the render mode of a component to interactive auto. This means that the component will initially use the interactive server render mode. Meanwhile, the WebAssembly-based .NET runtime and the Blazor app bundle will get downloaded to the client browser and the render mode switches to interactive WebAssembly. Finally, we can set the interactive render mode to auto, server and WebAssembly and interactivity location to global. This will turn on interactive auto rendering globally for the entire application. So in this video, we had a look at the two templates for creating Blazor apps. Hope you found the video useful. Thanks for watching.